I'm Stefano Bertuzzi. I'm the chief executive at ASM. You're joining the American Society for Microbiology for a very important conversation on microbes and what the microbial sciences can do to address the menace, the threat of climate change, the real threat and present threat of climate change. And I would like to be super quick to leave as much space as possible to our amazing panel today. But I would like to get one point across right at the outset of this from my own personal perspective. And I think that several of the panelists will pick up on this, expressing their own thoughts. I'd like to say that when we look at climate change and this incredible challenge in front of us, I am a techno-optimist, meaning that I think that science and innovation and discovery will get us out of the hole and will help us enormously in this direction. This said, it's not an all or none issue. It's very important that certain behaviors that we have and the way we do certain things in our daily life will also have to change. But it is thanks to science that we'll be able to address these fundamental threats. Otherwise, we'll just be rearranging chairs on the Titanic, so to speak. And however, science is not just one thing. I'd like to make a distinction here that if we look in the arena of physics and inorganic chemistry, the abundance of photons, electrons, ions to produce energy or heat, or actually these days, probably better cool, and the minerals that we have may actually possible to make to produce zero carbon emission energy, and that is just a fact because of the abundance. However, in the area of organic chemistry and biology, which is everything that has to do with life on Earth, of photosynthesis, the production of complex hydrocarbons, carbohydrates and protein molecules, and the implication for land use, I'm sure we'll hear a lot from Dr. Handelsman on this, we have to recognize that the inherent planetary boundaries that we are confined to, these resources, are not unlimited and are constraining us, even the innovation. And here is where I hope today you'll realize how microbes, who are by far the best chemists in the world, can actually be an asset and sometimes a foe for addressing climate change through science and innovation when we talk about this more biological aspect that are rate limiting steps for zero carbon emissions and sustainable and renewable energy. And I think that the panelists today will illuminate us in this direction and the implications for the environment and for health on us. So let me just say that as ASM, an organization, a society, a professional society of over 30,000 members, because of what I just mentioned, we are deeply committed to supporting and collaborating with efforts in climate change, both in the US and also internationally, to ensure that climate science through research funding and evidence-based policies are really harnessed as much as possible. Please see the organization of ASM as an asset for informing, providing expert, finding path, exploring in this direction. And I hope that you'll understand that often there isn't much in the conversation about the role of microbes, as I mentioned, friends and foes sometimes regarding climate change. But we believe that microbiology and microbiologists need to have a seat at the table in this discussion regarding climate change. Today, to this end, we brought together truly our brightest minds who are working across the spectrum of the microbial sciences to really work with us and guide us in this thinking. ASM, through the American Academy of Microbiology, which is a component of the organization, the honorific arm, has developed a 5-year plan that is led by Dr. Lennon, who will speak in a second, and will focus on the role of microbes in climate change. So I really hope that today's briefing will begin a dialogue between microbiologists and policymakers to inform about possible paths for climate change solution. So today's event is focusing specifically on where microbiologists are making a significant impact on issues that are a hot topic for climate change: the importance of soil and the threat of novel infectious diseases. And we are helped in this by wonderful speakers that will be introduced in a second by Dr. Jay Lennon, who I'm passing the microphone to. Dr. Lennon is leading the American Academy of Microbiology scientific portfolio on climate change and will be our moderator today. So thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to this event. Thank you, Jay. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Stefano. I'm Dr. Jay Lennon. I'm a professor of biology at Indiana University, and I'm chairing the American Academy of Microbiology's newly created scientific advisory task force on climate change. As Dr. Bertuzzi noted, the American Society of Microbiology has embarked on a 5-year scientific portfolio, which is focused on microbes, bacteria, viruses, and other groups of microbes that are the most abundant biological entities on the planet, and how they respond to and can affect climate change. This is one of the biggest goals, being better integrate microbiology and climate change science. The ASM has also just released a policy paper with recommendations for how Congress and the administration can best support and collaborate with the scientific community. This is available on the American Society of Microbiology's website, but we'll also be sending out a link to the public policy paper and the Academy's resource page on climate change to everyone who's registered for today's briefing. Our hope is that today's briefing will inspire you to think about how we can incorporate consideration of microbes into climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. So today, you're going to be hearing from 2 highly esteemed scientists who are bringing microbes to the forefront of climate change policy conversations. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Hotez. He's the Dean of National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine. There, he is also co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, CVD, and the Texas Children's Hospital of Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. Dr. Hotez is an internationally recognized physician scientist in neglected tropical diseases and vaccine development. As co-director of the Texas Children's CVD, he leads a team and product development partnership for developing new vaccines for hookworm infections, schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, SARS, MERS, and SARS-2 coronavirus, diseases which together affect hundreds of millions of children and adults worldwide, while championing success for access for vaccines globally and with the United States. Our second speaker today is Dr. Jo Handelsman. She's the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery at the University of Madison in Wisconsin. She's a Villas Research Professor and Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor. Previously, she served as Science Advisor to President Barack Obama as the Associate Director for Science at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she served there for 3 years and was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin and Yale University prior to that. Dr. Handelsman has received her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in molecular biology and has since authored over 200 scientific research publications, 30 editorials, and 29 essays. She's responsible for groundbreaking studies in microbial communication and works in the growing, expanding field of microbial metagenomics. She's also widely recognized for her contributions to science education and diversity in science. And in 2019, Dr. Handelsman was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So now we're going to be hearing from Dr. Hotez and then Dr. Handelsman, and following that, we're going to have a question and answer period for 15 minutes before we wrap up the presentations. Dr. Hotez, the microphone is now yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, and I always find it very meaningful to work with ASM. One of the reasons why we established our National School of Tropical Medicine in Texas and on the Gulf Coast was because of the emergence of tropical diseases here. We've seen rises in diseases such as dengue and Zika in South Texas, chikungunya virus infection, but also Chagas disease and typhus and parasitic worm infections such as toxocariasis, even hookworm in the southern United States. And we were modeled after as a mini-me version of the London School or the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, or as I like to say, the difference is we're in a disease endemic country, which is the Republic of Texas and the Gulf Coast. And because of the diseases emerging there, in no small measure due to climate change. Now, we have been looking at the impact of climate change on the emergence of microbial diseases, both in the U.S. and globally, and I kind of put them in two buckets, which I wrote about in my book published last year called "Preventing the Next Pandemic." And the first bucket is the indirect effects, because it's not always climate change alone, but climate change seeming to act in concert with other 21st century forces such as political instability, outright conflict, human migrations, urbanization, deforestation. And there's something about this combination of climate change with the social determinants rather than climate change as an isolated factor that's kind of creating that secret sauce that's causing disease to arise. So let me give you a few examples. One is on the Arabian Peninsula, where, as many know, there's been unprecedented temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius or more, not only in the Arabian Peninsula, but elsewhere in Central Asia. And as a consequence of that, you're seeing destruction of crops, drying up of ancient agricultural lands, because it's not just the higher temperatures, it's the drought that comes with it. So it's those hot, dry conditions that are actually causing people to give up ancient agricultural pursuits and then moving into cities such as Aleppo or Damascus. And that itself is causing instability. So some even ascribe all of the violence in the Middle East and on the ISIS occupation in part due to the instability caused by climate change and water allocation. So what you're seeing in the Middle East then and the Arabian Peninsula are unprecedented temperatures, aggressive urbanization, war, political unrest, human migrations. And what you're seeing is interruption of vaccination programs that have led to measles and polio. We've seen the halting of vector control programs together with maybe direct effects of climate on diseases such as leishmaniasis, which is transmitted by sandflies, so unprecedented cases of cutaneous leishmaniasis, which is not a fatal disease, but it causes a very disfiguring condition that the locals call Aleppo evil. And so that's an example. Another is in Venezuela and Central Latin America, where you have the socioeconomic collapse due to the Maduro regime, together with periods of drought and unprecedented temperatures, that is causing individuals to flee the city, sometimes going into the gold mining camps where they're being exposed to sleeping outdoors without bed nets, being exposed to malaria mosquitoes, and the temperature and the rate of malaria has risen dramatically, as well as other vector-borne diseases like dengue and Chagas disease. And also what you're seeing is the halting of vaccination programs because of the socioeconomic collapse. So people with measles fleeing across the border into Brazil, into neighboring Colombia, and affecting ancient indigenous people that are now severely suffering from the effects of measles as a consequence, with high morbidity and mortality, almost similar to the first European colonization to the New World. And there are other examples as well. And of course, here in Texas and the Gulf Coast, we're seeing the emergence or reemergence of the vector-borne diseases that I've just mentioned. Now, in addition to that, we're also seeing more direct effects from high thermal temperatures and drought caused by climate change. And in some cases, it's causing the emergence of infections. In other cases, the redistribution. So, for instance, in Eastern Africa, where high temperatures and drought conditions are actually maybe lowering rates of schistosomiasis, which is transmitted by snails that are sensitive to the effects of climate and drought. But at higher elevations, it's in higher and lower latitudes, it's actually producing the emergence there. So it's really causing a redistribution. So while you might have schistosomiasis rates lowering in East Africa, now you've got the appearance of schistosomiasis on the island of Corsica, off the coast of France. So this very interesting redistribution. Hookworm infection. Hookworm is a parasitic worm infection, a big cause of anemia. There, the larval stages in the soil are highly thermotolerant, according to Simon Brooker, when he was at the London School. Now he's with the Gates Foundation, but he showed the higher thermal tolerance means that can become the predominant parasitic helminth infection in Africa, potentially at the expense of other soil-transmitted helminths, such as ascariasis or trichuriasis, and similar to the redistribution of malaria. I think another important effect now that we're starting to see is in this time of food catastrophes and food insecurity, because of the prolonged periods of drought and high temperatures in East Africa. You're seeing the food insecurity increase. And of course, this is exacerbated by how Russia is blocking food exports, grain exports from the port of Odessa. So that 1-2 punch is, according to some, projected to will result in mass starvation events. And with that food insecurity and malnutrition, we know certain infections are much more aggressive. Leishmaniasis or tuberculosis, these measles, these prey are predatory on individuals who are malnourished, and so yet that is another effect. So I think what we're seeing is that the interaction with elevated temperatures, altered rainfall patterns, all of the things that are associated with climate change is having a disproportionate impact on the rise of microbial diseases. And this is going to be something that occupies us for a long time. And finally, I'll just mention that the other piece of this is something that I remember Al Gore once told me, and he presents it when he was presenting his films a few years back, which is that the climate change always disproportionately affects the vulnerable, those who live in poverty, because those who live in poverty tend to live in areas that are more susceptible to catastrophic weather events and climate change. So poverty is a big driver for infectious diseases, of course. So even though we call them neglected tropical diseases, they're first and foremost diseases of poverty. Now we can factor in climate change upon that. So the point is, no question, climate change is going to be a huge driver of human microbial diseases, but not in always straightforward, direct ways. And it may be through some of the indirect effects operating through the social determinants that I mentioned that it may have its biggest impact. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Hotez. We'll put off any questions till after our next speaker, which is Dr. Joe Handelsman.
I'm going to talk today about the intersection of soil, climate, and the microorganisms that mediate that interaction. So it's worth taking a look at what soil is, because most people don't think every day about the health of their soil or the amount of soil that's around them, and even less about the composition of soil. Soil contains a heterogeneous mixture, and that's the first aspect of soil that's so important. It's not like a single substance. It's not just water, H2O. It contains many, many, many compounds and structures. And so it's that heterogeneous mixture of particles of different sizes, like we see at the bottom, the sand, silt, and clay particles, materials of different geologic origin, and that determines most of the characteristics of the soil. And then, very importantly, the living and dying and dead plants, animals, and microorganisms. There are about between 1 billion and 10 billion microorganisms per gram of soil. That's about half a teaspoon of soil. So they are the most abundant life on Earth, but literally in the Earth as well. So this complex mixture supports our food supply. And As Dr. Hotez said, we are under threat because of climate change in terms of our food supply and food security worldwide. And this is an American problem, a US problem, as well as international, because all food availability affects all people on Earth. This, by the way, is an example of one of the greatest soils on Earth. It is in Ukraine, just outside Kyiv. And it is a very special kind of soil that we have here in the United States, in the Midwest, this very dark, deep, rich soil. Its fertility is pretty much unparalleled by any other soil type, and it covers a very small proportion of the Earth. And Ukraine, the United States, and a small portion of China are the only places that you find this particular kind of soil. But the soil has many effects and is affected by many things besides just food production and agriculture. And so one of the things that's critical to understand is the relationship of the atmosphere, plants, and microbes, and carbon balance. So when a plant, in this case a tree, is exposed to sunlight and it has photosynthetic capacity in its leaves, it will take atmospheric carbon dioxide and what we call it is fixing. It will fix that carbon and make all the chemical structures that contain carbon in a plant. The sugars, the amino acids, the proteins, the DNA, all of the things that we associate with life itself are then synthesized from that carbon. And this is the primary source of our carbon on Earth. There's roughly about half of our carbon in trees and plants on Earth, and half of it is fixed in trees and plants, and about half of it is fixed by microbes in the oceans. I'm going to focus today on this cycle on Earth. When a plant has sufficient carbon, it transports that carbon to the roots. And plants do this to different degrees, but some plants transport most of their carbon to their roots, which is quite remarkable. Perennial plants often will accumulate and leave behind 70% of the carbon that they fix in a growing season in their roots. That carbon is then partially secreted into the soil, and there microorganisms will snack on it and change it to other compounds. Some of these compounds are very stable, long polysaccharides, long structures that actually are the glue that sticks soil particles together to give it its structure. That's a relatively stable form of carbon in soil. But they can also take this carbon that's been fixed by the plants and they can convert it to carbon dioxide and methane. And those are the reactions we want to inhibit in the soil while we're maximizing the amount of carbon that is stored. So we just talked about storing carbon in the soil. Is this a big phenomenon? Well, the answer is it's an enormous phenomenon. So the soil itself across the Earth carries about 2,500 billion tons of carbon. That's a lot of carbon. And this represents, just for comparison, 3 times as much as all of the carbon in the Earth's entire atmosphere, or 4 to 5 times as much as the carbon in all the plants and trees on Earth. So we always think of the relationship between carbon in the atmosphere as being obviously a very important source, and then being stored in plant matter. But in fact, it's both stored and released from soil because there's this just enormous amount of soil enormous amount of carbon in the soil. To date, we've lost about half of the soil's carbon, and that has happened largely since 1850, when we started modern agriculture. So in just a few short years, about 170 years, we've lost half of the soil's carbon that was stored there for millennia. Most of these soils are very old and have been carrying their carbon for a long time. So if we've lost about half of our carbon in soil, that would suggest that soil could store much more than it currently does. in other words, twice as much, we could replace that carbon and place an enormous amount of carbon in a repository that once held this amount. So we're not putting it into some new structure deep in the earth as people have proposed storing carbon. This is just putting carbon back where it belongs. But instead, today, we're eroding the soil at great rates, and that is accompanied by loss of carbon from the soil and often into the atmosphere. This is an example of severe soil erosion in Africa, but it also happens to an enormous degree in our country as well. In the United States, we see very severe erosion in various areas. It varies enormously, of course, across the landscape of the US. But this is an example in Iowa, some of our most productive farmland in the country. And the producer of, I think it's if it were a country, it'd be the 7th largest agricultural producer in the world. And you can see here that all of these light tan spots are where all of the topsoil is gone. And the farmers are essentially farming subsoil in the places where you see this light tan pigmentation. And that's largely due to water erosion, which is the problem in the Midwest. In the far West, it's more wind erosion. And water droplets seem like they're very gentle most of the time, but for a soil particle or a clump of soil, they're actually quite violent because they carry enormous momentum that can break up the structure of the soil and wash away soil particles, taking with it the carbon, or the carbon can be released. So if we look at erosion across the United States, the USDA estimates that on average, our erosion is about 5 tons per acre per year. In Iowa, there has been some acreage that's been clocked at 25 to 50 tons per acre per year. That soil will not last very long. And then in some years, there has been very severe weather in the last decade in Iowa that affected in 1 year a 50 ton per acre loss just in one rainstorm. So soil is generated about half a ton per acre, half a ton per acre per year. And here we have 50 tons, so 100 times the amount of soil that we generate in a single year was lost in one rainstorm on one day. So this is the kind of loss that we're now faced with, and we have to start taking seriously. It's even worse than that. The USDA average is 5 tons per acre per year, but we know it goes higher than that. One of the reasons that it's much higher than that is that the USDA estimate doesn't account for ephemeral gullies. This is a process by which soil erosion, usually by water erosion, forms these gullies that exist briefly and then they often get filled in. But it's very hard to measure that kind of erosion that happens in the ephemeral gullies. And so our national statistics don't account for it. So 5 tons per acre per year is probably a minimum. So when I was in the White House, we did some calculations of how long would the soil last at various rates of loss. And what we estimated, starting with an acre of soil that, say, has about 1,000 tons per acre, such as a typical soil in Iowa, if it were eroding at 5 tons per acre per year, you would see the curve at the rate that, that you see here, the highest line. And that's not as scary as it might be from the tone of my talk, because you see that we really wouldn't run out of soil until well into the 2100s. We start seeing enormous effects on yield when we hit about the halfway point. So we would reach that halfway point just after about 100 years from now. That's at 5 tons per acre per year if that national average held. But there are reasons to think that that national average, first of all, underestimates the rate of soil loss, and that this rate will get larger over time. And so here you see some of the estimates. If, for example, we were losing soil in 25 tons per acre per year, that land would be out of soil by 2060. If we were eroding at 100 tons per acre per year, we would be out of soil, topsoil, in just a few years. And why do I think that these higher rates of erosion are reasonable? Well, one of the factors is climate change itself. So in the early part of the 20th century, the first half, the weather, the precipitation in the United States clustered around a mean, which you see here. It's called zero in this case. And you can see that sometimes we got more rain than the mean, and many times it was less than the mean, as you would expect, since the mean is the average. But we started to see a very different trend in the second half of the 20th century. So whereas we stuck around this mean for about 50 years, since the 1950s, we have exceeded that mean by greater amounts every year. And you can see this increase is really steep. So that in the 2000s, we're up to probably about 4 times as much heavy precipitation. These are the severe storms that are most likely to erode soil than we had in even the high years of the early 20th century. And so this represents damage to soil. This represents erosion of soil particles, because heavy precipitation is the greatest force we have in the United States that destroys soil. So these faster rates of erosion start looking very reasonable when you think that we're having 2, 3, and 4 times as many heavy precipitation events each year that will drive that soil off the acreage. So it's very doubtful that we're eroding even at 5 tons per acre per year. We're probably eroding at higher rates than that, but that rate will also get faster as we move through what is predicted and projected to be the course of climate change. So today, 25% of the state of Iowa, one of our greatest agricultural gifts in this country, 25% of that cropland has no topsoil. That's a quarter of Iowa's topsoil is gone, of the land is devoid of topsoil. So what can we do about this? The good news is that this is a problem we could fix. We can fix it almost immediately if we want to. And that's because we've been studying this as modern day scientists for years. And indigenous people have been using practices that preserve soil for millennia. And there are some indigenous groups that have been farming in the same place for thousands of years with no evidence of erosion. So the kind of erosion we're seeing today is not just a normal outcome of agriculture. So one method that we learned about in the 70s, but just hasn't been adopted as broadly as we had hoped in the 70s, is no-till planting, where instead of plowing open a furrow, the farmers will drill the seeds into the soil and plant into essentially last year's crop residue. And this is great because it protects the soil structure. Plowing is the very worst thing we do to soil. And it also preserves the carbon that was in last year's residue. If we plow that residue, it's far more likely to be decomposed and turned into carbon dioxide, or in some cases methane, and that will contribute to climate change. Another method is cover cropping. So for about 8 months a year in the Midwest, where we have long winters, there's no cover on our soil. If you fly over the Midwest in the winter season, for about 8 months, you just see large expanses of brown land. That should never happen. And a simple solution to that is to cover crop, which means after the main crop is harvested, another crop is planted in the fall. It's allowed to grow before frost, and then it remains in place until the following season. It will increase the organic matter of the soil for future crops. That's great. It will increase overall carbon, and it will prevent erosion, which will reduce the loss of carbon from the soil. Another method that has been wildly successful is prairie strips. So strip cropping of this type is an old tradition, but it's been reinvigorated by a team in Iowa, where they take just 10% of the corn out of production and replace it with these strips of prairie plants. Prairie plants are the plants that originally formed the great soils of the Midwest. They're deep-rooted and they leave most of their carbon behind at the end of the season. And so a corn plant will leave about 1% of its carbon in the soil. A typical perennial prairie plant will leave 70% of its carbon. And so just by replacing 10% of the corn with strips of prairie plants, we can reduce the erosion by 90%. That's, in science, we rarely see things that are as effective as that. So 90% reduction of erosion on this land where only 10% has been put into prairie. And we can talk later if people are interested in why farmers don't do that. So other key actions, one that we must think about and research very heavily is how we store carbon in soil in a stable form, because stable means that the microorganisms won't be converting it to carbon dioxide and methane at high rates. So you may have heard of biochar, which is a very stable form of carbon that is not degraded over very long periods of time. And burying biochar in soil is one very good possibility for increasing soil carbon storage. Another practice that we have to worry a lot about is nitrogen use. We use a lot of nitrogen fertilizer to nourish our crops. And this is also thought to be propping up yields, despite the fact that our soil is getting thinner and less productive. The nitrogen can boost yields to overcome that for a period of time. But that nitrogen, when it's not taken up by plants, can turn into nitrous oxide. And once again, it's the microorganisms in soil that carry out this reaction of nitrogen fertilizer to nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. Fortunately, it's not all that long-lived, such as carbon dioxide, but its potential for warming is much greater than carbon dioxide. So it's considered one of the greatest threats to climate change. I'll end with a quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who said, "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And an earth that destroys its soil will certainly destroy itself." This is much truer today than it was when Roosevelt said it in 1937, because now we know that destroying soil also leads to an increase in climate change. And of course, if anyone's interested in reading more, I recently published a book on this issue called A World Without Soil.
Thank you, Dr. Handelsman. With the conclusion of the two presentations, we'll now enter the question and answer period. If you have questions or comments that you would like to convey to the speaker, I would ask that you kindly put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start off with a couple questions here. Recently, there was a policy publication that was released by the American Society of Microbiology. And so one of the recommendations is for better public-facing communication of climate change research. So keeping our audience in mind, how do you think we can improve communication with both policymakers and the public on the threats of climate change and steps to mitigate the impacts of climate change in general, but also with respect to things that are harder to see, like the microbes that are on us and around us in the soil and in human populations?
Who do you want to?
Peter, would you start us off with that?
Okay, yeah, I think there are two components to this. I think first of all, the climate scientists have been heavily targeted by the anti-science aggression lobby for a few years now, for 10 years now. I'm sure Dr. Handelsman has probably been hit as well and targeted, people like my colleagues like Michael Mann. And so that, the climate scientists have been heavily targeted by the anti-science extremism, a lot of it coming from the far right, for 10 years. And now it's our turn as biomedical scientists. We're being targeted, especially people like myself who are vaccine scientists, but also virologists who are being accused unfairly of being involved in gain-of-function research around COVID-19. So I think that is a 1-2 punch of the microbiologists, virologists, and the climate scientists are being targeted. And I think, and this is important for our scientific societies like ASM and also the national academies, is how do we go up against this? I think, part of the problem has been that most scientific societies and our training as scientists always says that we're supposed to be politically neutral and not talk about impolite things like Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives. But, honestly, the aggression is coming from the far right, right? I mean, it's both for climate science and vaccines and virologic research. It's coming out of the CPAC conference. First they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles, and then they're going to vaccinate you, or they're going to vaccinate you and then take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, a quarter of the country accepts it, and it's amplified, of course, nightly on by the Fox News anchors. So how do we begin chipping away at that while preserving our political neutrality when the attacks are very much along a partisan divide? So that's one part. I think the other is, ASM has been really good about public science communication, and they've been really at the forefront of this more than most organizations. But I think, now we're reaching the point when scientists do speak out about these issues like climate science, climate change, talking about vaccines. We're being attacked, and a lot of the academic institutions, academic health centers, universities are not quite sure how to manage it because they don't like seeing their faculty and scientists attacked. But the response usually is, well, just don't speak out at all, because by speaking out, all you do is put the institution at risk. And that's not the answer, because I think it's part of those attitudes and the silence that follows that actually creates a vacuum, and the vacuum gets filled by the anti-science space and by I don't even call it misinformation or disinformation or at all. I call it anti-science aggression. And I have a new book coming out about this with Johns Hopkins University Press in a few months. So I think we that's a long way of saying we don't really know what to do. And it's not well organized and coordinated, and it's very hit or miss whether scientific societies are going to be out in front counteracting anti-science attitudes and anti-science activism, and whether the individual universities and institutions, how they're prepared to back scientists. So especially, for me, I'm a tenured professor and fairly well established, but what about a postdoc? What about an assistant professor? They speak out, with the sort of Damocles hanging over their heads, which basically says universities tell them, well, you can, you're free to speak out, of course, but you do it at your own risk and don't screw it up and get the institution in trouble. So that has a pretty chilling effect. So I think we need to really look at a culture change in our scientific profession to make scientists feel more comfortable speaking out about these issues, knowing that we're going to get a lot of pushback from groups that have political agendas, and help figuring out how to navigate that very complicated roadmap, I think, is going to be a real challenge for us in the 2020s.
Dr. Handelsman, regarding policy, so your presentation focused a little bit less on diseases, but still addressed important climate change issues related to natural resources and environmental microbiology. I was wondering if you had any opinions on how those topics could be better communicated with policymakers.
Yeah, I think it's a different but similar question, a related question when it comes to agriculture and the environment. One of the big differences is that farmers know climate change is happening. Whether they want to call it climate change or global warming or admit to their neighbors in conservative rural America that they believe in it, they do recognize that the climate and the weather patterns have changed. There's no denying that part. And so I think one of the things we can learn from communication studies is that sometimes we want to avoid the target topic, which in this case is climate, and talk about something that the farmers actually care about, which is soil. Talk about preserving soil. Well, an outcome of preserving soil will also be to mitigate and reduce the future increase in climate change, but we don't have to necessarily sell it on that score. So I think partly it's how we message and what we consider to be the important outcome. Do we feel we must get people to agree with us that climate change is real and happening and getting worse? Or do we want them to change actions? And I think it's much easier to change actions, particularly when their livelihood depends on it. I think.
Can I just say something? I think, Joe, you're definitely onto something very important because, doing the research for this book on, anti-science, I came across the writings of Valerie Reina, who's an expert in science communication from Cornell and Ithaca. And she basically said what you're saying, which is that it's, the idea that we just counteract this with facts is not working. That you have to appeal to core human values, and I think that so there is an art to doing science communication, and I think you sort of hit on it, Joe. Hitting the core of the human values of the individual and the groups, that's going to be very important. And it means entering into a dialogue with experts in science communication. There are not a lot of them, but I think there is some method to this rather than what we've done in the past, which simply said, well, if we give people enough facts, they'll figure it out. And clearly that's not happening.
I totally agree. It's not just an art. It definitely is a science. And there's extremely good research on how various kinds of communication and approaches to communication work. I think we also have several programs that have trained scientists to be good communicators with the public or with journalists. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has SciLine, which is a group dedicated to training reporters to talk to scientists and training scientists to talk to reporters. And we had a session from them at my institute, and people said that it would transform the way they think of science communication. So I think we could be teaching the real principles of science communication, not just telling people, how to speak in a more organized way or whatever it is we teach. The other thing we need is a lot more education. We need to start with science training in K-12 being much more important and paying much better attention to it. For example, in K through 8, we don't require teachers to have much of a background in science. So the result is we tend to get science phobes in teaching our younger kids. And only when children get to high school are they getting teachers that actually had a major in science, teaching them science. So I think we need to work on science education throughout the system, and then communication education for our graduate students, postdocs, and faculty across the country.
Yeah, one other thing I'd say is, and I totally agree with all of that, is not only encouraging communication and providing science communication offerings for our graduate and postdoctoral education, but actually incentivizing young scientists to do it. I mean, I get evaluated like everybody else. I don't see patients anymore, but what do I get asked about? I get asked about my grants and my papers, and my grants and my papers, and my grants and my papers, and nowhere on my annual evaluation form is anything that I do in the area of science communication, whether it's on the cable news networks or writing opinion pieces or commentaries for journals. So the subliminal or not so subliminal message that you get is, as a faculty member, is we don't value this, that it's not only is not it's not important and is not going to contribute to your career advancement. And I would love to see that flipped around. I mean, not everybody wants to be out there and doing public engagement, and that's fine too. But I think for those of us who, especially young scientists who want to be out there in the public domain, and the commitment for young people to public service is extraordinary. They all, if I'm doing an in-person talk these days, and I'm sure, Joe, it's the same with you, it's, you get a small line of people coming up afterwards and they say, hey, doc, I'm all in, how do I do this? And then you have to kind of take the wind out of the balloon a little bit by saying, well, it's not really, encouraged, and there aren't really good career paths for people who want to be out there at a time when we need it more than ever.
So recently we've been hearing that the White House may declare a climate emergency. I'd like to hear from both of you on what you think such a declaration should include regarding climate sciences and perhaps microbes. Joe, would you like to start?
I think it needs to address some of the easily adopted practices that would affect climate change. And I mentioned a few earlier, and there are many others that we could all engage in. So I think somewhere in that emergency statement, we need to have a declaration that this is a fixable problem, not easily fixable, but it can be addressed, listing some of the behaviors of individuals, of municipalities, private organizations, industry, and government at a national level that could be engaged upon to mitigate climate change. So I think that's one really important one. And then attention has to be paid to the microorganisms and what they're doing, because if we don't pay attention, they can sometimes get the wrong message and go in the wrong direction. And instead of fixing carbon, they may be evolving carbon and worsening climate change. So we have to be very scientific about the practices that we engage in, but we know of practices that mitigate climate change that have been used for thousands of years. So we know the outcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say regarding declared emergencies, I'm checking my iPhone, waiting for the monkeypox emergency to be declared this afternoon by the White House, and we'll see if that happens. And it's not totally unrelated. Among the things that I see on social media or emails I get is, hey, what the heck is going on? First COVID-19, now monkeypox, now polio, now Marburg virus. What's going on? Well, I do think a component of that is climate change, and together with deforestation and where you're coming into contact with bats and other vectors, reservoirs of human disease, together with human migrations and political instability. All of that is jumbled together and creating this new normal of new microbial diseases emerging.
So Dr. Bertuzzi, in his introduction, cast microbes as being friends or foes. So I have a two-part question. I'm going to start with Dr. Hotez, and this comes from one of the participants. In your opinion, is the emergence of antibiotic microbial resistance to pathogens important in the context of climate change? And if so, how?
Well, certainly it's become a huge issue, right? I mean, we're seeing this at unprecedented levels. If we weren't talking, if COVID had never emerged or emerged in a few years, which and there still may be other major coronaviruses, I think AMR, antimicrobial resistance, would be a huge topic of conversation right now and one of our gravest threats. And by the way, it hasn't gone away. I can't, maybe there are experts listening that understand how AMR might interface with climate change. To me, it's not intuitively obvious, although certainly since many of our pathogens are soil-borne pathogens, there may be that interaction as well.
There are also wild repositories of antibiotic resistance genes in the soil. My lab has found them in all soils, and many others have looked as well. And some of our farming practices themselves increase the rate at which the organisms carrying those genes proliferate. But of course, one of the most important things we do is applying antibiotics to the environment. And so I think as we see soil moving more, we're going to be spreading those resistance genes, as well as the antibiotics that cause the resistance to develop and spread.
So Dr. Handelsman, there's a number of questions regarding management, farmer practices, and incentives, and related to whether or not, how do we incentivize farmers to adopt some of these different land use practices, which may not only benefit soil, but the microbes that live in those habitats?
That's a great question. And I will give the brief answer, but I can say that we have a policy document that the Day One organization developed with a panel of people, and I can give you the URL for that if you're interested, and has a full-length description of all the policy moves. But the big one is taking away the disincentives. I was surprised when I found out when I was in the White House that the reason farmers don't adopt things like strip cropping is that if a farmer reduces the amount of corn she or he is growing by 10%, they get 10% less crop insurance. Well, farmers work at such small margins, they can't afford that. Now, in the long run, we know from long-term experiments that by moving to no-till or strip cropping, any of these practices that reduce soil erosion will increase production and increase the stability of soil. Its ability to take up water in both floods and droughts and store water will be increased by improving its health. And so you're less likely to need that crop insurance. So in the long run, I think it will save everyone money to increase the quality of the soil. But if we're disincentivizing the farmers, they will never get to that stage where they're actually gaining the benefits from it. We do have some incentives, but USDA has been stripped of a lot of the resources that it used to have to monitor what farmers do and to hold them accountable for the plans for soil preservation and land conservation that they commit to. And so I think we need to restore that. It's a great time to talk about it because we're in the process of writing the 23 Farm Bill. And so this would be the time to get some new incentives in there.
Dr. Hotez, you talked a lot about how disease-causing organisms and emerging pathogens may be redistributed and expanding due to climate change. And we've heard a little bit about some proactive ways where we can affect microbes due to land use practices, like we just heard about farmers. Are there any things that we can do beyond development of vaccines in the face of climate change that would spread and reduce the effects of emerging diseases in a changing world?
Well, I think, the other big factor that, I found in doing research for the book is urbanization. I mean, if you look at for the first time ever, more of the global population lives in urban environments than in rural environments. And that process seems to be accelerating, so that, projections are by 2050, what the world's going to look like are clusters of mega cities, cities with 10 million people or more. And in so many instances that those mega cities, the growth is so accelerated that it's outstripping the infrastructure needed to maintain safe environments for large populations, in terms of control of sewage, in terms of ensuring adequate water and safe water. And of course, all of that means we're going to see more microbial pathogens in those very concentrated urban areas. And so that would include the ascendancy of respiratory virus pathogens, for instance. I also am concerned that maybe what we're seeing is urban adaptation of microbes. So for instance, one of the diseases that I've studied my whole life is called human hookworm infection. And we've always said that that's a disease that occurs in rural environments. Well, guess what? We're seeing urban hookworm now. So what does that mean? Is there some kind of urban adaptation of the larvae in the soil, which tend to be very hardy and very thermotolerant? And now we're seeing that selectively outcompete other soil helminth pathogens. So maybe that's going on as well. So I think we should, when we think about climate change, we should also think about accelerated urbanization as well. And we're looking at, Houston, Texas right now is 100 degrees. It's been 100 degrees all of June. Where I am, 100 degrees all June and July. And, summer here is never great, but it hasn't been like this since I can remember moving here, more than a decade ago. And that's the way the world's going to be. It's going to be these hot, steamy mega cities, like Delhi, like Kinshasa, like Dhaka, like Karachi, and like Houston, and recognize that we will see microbial adaptations to that. And maybe monkeypox is yet another example of that. And I think the other aspect of this that is difficult is our universities and the way funding goes and promotions go tend to be quite siloed. So you often times tend to be disincentivized for doing that kind of interdisciplinary work that is so important, right? I mean, how often, tried writing an NIH grant where a virologist writes a grant together with an urban planner or a sociologist or a political scientist. So I think we're going to need more and more of those uncomfortable discussions and dialogues between the different academic disciplines and find ways to incentivize that.
Dr. Handelsman, there's a question about other strategies beyond prairie strips that might promote the storage of carbon in deeper soils, which may have been affected by agricultural activities over the past couple hundred years. Are there any ways or considerations in management that we might be able to use for increasing the storage of deep carbon?
Well, I don't think agriculture has affected the deep carbon storage anywhere near as much as it has the topsoil, because the very practices that degrade the soil only affect the top, basically the tillage layer. We can, however, get carbon down to deep levels below 2 meters by using deep-rooted plants, and that is trees and prairie plants. There are prairie plants where a single plant will have a 15-foot root system. Switchgrass, for example, has been shown to have these massive roots. And it's not just the depth, it's the overall mass of the roots is so great that they contribute large amounts of carbon throughout the soil profile that they're affecting. Some people have suggested injecting carbon or burying carbon at deep levels. I frankly am a little bit hesitant to think about that because we have done so much damage to our soils by disturbing them that I'm not sure we know enough, and we need more research on this to know what happens when we start disturbing the lower levels, lower layers of soil. So I'm very cautious about some of those methods, but I do think that we can get more soil, more carbon into the topsoil very easily through biochar and cover crops and strip cropping and not getting rid of it, not losing it by plowing. And that in itself has the capacity to mitigate climate change. Probably if we really worked at it, as much as a third of our emissions could be offset by increasing carbon in soil.
As a follow-up question, we know that the amount of carbon that's stored in soils is it's on par with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But about 70% of the globe is occupied by marine ecosystems. And so there's a question from one of the attendees. Are there recommendations for how we can advance ocean microbial research to make progress related to climate change? And that question could be open to either Joe or Peter.
So is the question about research in the oceans?
It's about research in the oceans and how we may be able to is it possible to manage microorganisms in a way to remediate carbon and climate change on a global scale in the oceans? Or is that outside of our reach?
There have been a lot of discussion over the years about the use of iron in oceans, because iron is usually the limiting element in the life of microbes in the soil in the ocean. And the idea is that if you add iron, then you see a flush of photosynthetic organisms that will fix more carbon. That has been debated back and forth by experts because, again, like working in the very deep soils and trying to store carbon there, we don't know what damage we could be doing by applying massive quantities of iron to our oceans. So personally, I think that there are safer ways to approach the problem, and cleaning up our oceans probably is one of the best. Sometimes it's the simplest solution that will have the outcome that we desire. But I would let anyone else answer that. Jay, you probably know more about the oceans than I do.
I'm interested in the caution that you're referring to, and probably the need for many policymakers to make large changes on short time scales, which I'm sure is something that people in policy are curious about. So I'm not sure there's an answer to this question, but I think what I hear you saying, and maybe other people have comments on this, is that we need to be careful with large scale interventions, which could have unintended consequences.
Yes, we have enough experience over the last few decades to know that some of our best intentions have led to terrible outcomes environmentally. And since we have so many well-researched tools where we do know the outcomes very well, that will increase carbon storage and reduce carbon release, I think we should be employing those first before we try to manipulate the environment in dramatic ways.
I have one more question that I'd like to ask both of you. To recognize that the American Society of Microbiology has a diverse set of recommendations that cuts across multiple government agencies, involves diverse sets of policy areas. What is the one thing that we could highlight that could be done in the short term to make significant differences to climate change with regard to microorganisms?
Well, I can say, from my field of infectious diseases, that we do need to recognize that there is that interface between the emergence of disease and climate change, together with other social factors. The National Science Foundation has had a program in place of ecology for infectious diseases that has been looking at this for a few years, but from my perspective, it's still underfunded. And the one thing that I would like to see come out of, for instance, the NIH, for supporting scientists, is that kind of interdisciplinary approach, and to actually encourage that dialogue between the climate scientists and the microbiologists and the infectious disease specialists, and to really get our arms around why we are seeing this flourishing of COVID and monkeypox and poliovirus and the complicated social determinants that are working in concert with climate change. So I say that without really understanding at a granular level what the mechanisms are. We can have some hypotheses, but more of it is hypothesis generating than hypothesis testing. We still don't know to this day the factors that promoted the emergence of SARS, MERS, and now SARS-2, COVID-19. We know it's this confluence of human contact with bats through intermediate, whether it's livestock or other animals, and intuitively climate change does have a role. We know with Ebola, the same contact with bats probably is and associated with climate change is likely. But at a granular level, we really our understanding is extremely superficial. And I think it's a priority, because not only for by the biomedical scientists. But let's face it, I mean, COVID-19 and now monkeypox, those are, yes, they're public health issues, but they're also economic issues, right? These collapse the global economy and massive global security issues and political instability. So it affects all aspects of human endeavor, really understanding those links. But we need a lot more advocacy, both with the U.S. Congress and other aspects of the federal government and the United Nations, to emphasize those kinds of interdisciplinary interactions.
Joe, would you like to add to the question about some of the priorities that would give us immediate leg up on how to deal with climate change with regard to microbes?
Well, I have two. I know we were asked for one action, but I would say there are two, and they're related. One is to change the research priorities. So the agricultural research budget has traditionally been about between 1/10 and 100th of the NIH budget. And I'm not saying that we don't need NIH research. That is absolutely critical to our future as a species. But just from a scientific standpoint, the entire NIH budget goes to one organism, essentially. We're trying to keep the Homo sapiens species healthy. The agricultural budget goes to all animals that live on farms, all plants that we plant in our farms, and all the microbes that affect the health of the environment, as well as those animals and plants. And so I think we need to make that a greater priority. And if we had the kind of basic research in soil that has been applied to human health, we would be in a completely different situation now. We would know exactly what all of these interventions that we've talked about would do, and we'd be so much better at designing other interventions. So I think research in agricultural systems is absolutely a must for our government. And then the second thing is using the Farm Bill to incentivize farmers to do things that will benefit the environment, not just make money or satisfy other needs, but really do reduce climate change in addition to producing food.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, along those lines, looking at grant RFAs and grants that cut across different agencies, not only the NIH, but USDA, I think that'd be brilliant. Also with EPA as well, and bring those in to address these problems in the interdisciplinary manner that they need to be addressed at, because otherwise you just get these kind of one-dimensional responses to a far more complicated problem.
Okay. With that, I'd like to wrap up, and I'd like to thank Dr. Hotez and Dr. Handelsman and all of the participants and people listening in for joining us. And so that concludes our program. Again, thank you for your attendance, and have a great weekend. Thank you.